everyone. This is Victoria Wolders, your My Kids Locker COVID-19 Ed podcast host. Well, I'm so excited today because we have a special guest. Yes, a special guest. Chris Hall. He is the Ecosystem Study Area Manager at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia, Canada. We have our in-house science teacher, Tim Stephenson, interviewing him today on salmon. Yes, salmon. Salmon is extremely important, not only to our ecoculture, our ecosystem, but also for our well-being. And they're going to be talking a little bit today about the journey of the salmon and why the salmon has been important for our humans and our culture in the province of British Columbia for years, decades, centuries, but also talks about how dependent we are on the nutrients that salmon give to our soils and our water and our trees. I think you'll enjoy him talking to you about the journey of the salmon and the importance of this amazing fish that is found in our BC waters. Well, without further ado, here is Tim Stephenson interviewing Christopher Hall. Thank you.
This is Tim Stephenson, part of the COVID-19 Ed podcast, and today we have Chris Hall from Trinity Western University. And Chris, why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and the position that you fill at the university?
Sure, no problem. So my name is Christopher Hall, and I am Trinity Western University's Outdoor Labs Supervisor. So my job is I help to take care and manage all of Trinity's wildlife areas. Now, these are areas that Trinity Western uses either for teaching or for research here for our students, but is also opened up to the public as well. These areas are of special concern by the university, but also by the provincial, federal government in regards to endangered plant and animal species that you find there, particularly with some of our areas also would be in regards to salmon. So I'm a biologist. I'm a scientist here at the university. I've been here just over 20 years, and salmon is my love and my passion, and I'm so glad to be here today.
Well, the reason, of course, we have you on is because you are a salmon expert, and you have a lot to say about that particular animal in our ecosystem. So I thought I'd start with a question right off the bat. Maybe you could just tell us about the life of a salmon here in British Columbia and what sort of cycles that they go through.
Sure, yeah. So salmon have a very, very interesting life cycle. It's amazing how salmon are so uniquely adapted to life here on the coast of British Columbia. The salmon come in the fall and to lay their eggs. So they come and they lay, depending on the species, approximately we could say about 2,500 to about 4,000 eggs each for the female. So they come in and they lay their eggs. They're then fertilized, and then of course the parents die. Okay, so that's usually around October, November, depending on the river, depending on the species, because different salmon will use the river at different times and different parts of the river at different times. So after a couple of months, usually around, let's say about February, January, depending on temperature, depending on a bunch of different things, those eggs will start to have, they've been starting to grow, they've started to develop, and then usually around that time, they turn into what is called alevin. Now, they were in an egg, and they'd go through a whole bunch of different developmental stages within the egg. They then pop out of the egg. And when they pop out of the egg, that's when they're called an alevin. A-E-L-V-I-N, alevin.
Okay.
I think that's how it works. Anyway, so what happens is that they kind of look like a little tadpole in a way, right? So they have this big yolk sac on them, and they're living in the gravel still. They're still in the gravel, but they're living and feeding off of their yolk sac in order for them to get bigger and get stronger, so that when they come out of the gravel, they're called fry, and that's when they're able to now swim around and look for food. And there's big things that they look for. There's certain things that at this particular stage is really, really critical. Number one is, of course, they need water. They need clean, healthy, fresh water in order for them to survive. So they're looking for a place with good water quality that they can survive. They also need oxygen. So they need well oxygenated water in order for them to breathe. Salmon use gills in order to breathe. We, as humans, we use lungs, but we still need oxygen. It's still very, very important. So, and of course, we can breathe oxygen just using, with our lungs. Fish, on the other hand, have to find water that has oxygen in it. So it's very, very important that they have that. And of course, the next thing, of course, is they need food. They need adequate amounts of food in order food that is available to them so they can grow big and strong. And of course, they also need shelter as well. They need a place where they can hide, a place where they can rest, a place where they can kind of ambush food as it's coming down in the streams, and then go back to a hiding place. So those are the four things that they really need. So they're a fry, and they can be in this stage, depending on the species, anywhere for a couple of months, right up to 6, 7, 8 months. It really depends on the species of fish. Now, from fry, then they go into what's called a smolt stage. Now, this is when the fish is now approximately around that 2.5, 3.5 inch range. Okay, so now they're at a point where they're now starting to think about heading out to the ocean to go for their big long migration. So in Langley, in the Salmon River, this should usually be happening more or less actually around now. Actually, it can be where certain amounts of fish, chum and coho, things like that are of that particular size, start working themselves down the Salmon River into the Fraser River, right? And then eventually out into the ocean. So this is a time of transition. This is a time where they're getting used to salt water because, of course, we're connected to an ocean where we're very close to the ocean. So we have fluxes of salt water going in and out. And this is a time where they're transitioning to go into salt water. It takes a little bit of time for their bodies to get used to it. Okay, and when they are used to it, then they simply go out into the ocean and they start on their big long migration. And this is where it can become a little bit of a mystery as to where exactly what happens after that. We generally know where different species of salmon go, how far they travel, what their migration routes are. But really, once they kind of leave the Fraser, we start losing a lot of hands-on ability to collect data and to see what they're doing. So they're out there, they're going for the big long migration, and they can be out there for anywhere from about 2 years to 5 years for some fish, some certain subspecies of salmon, up to 7 years until they come back to their home rivers to spawn. So while they're out in the ocean, they're growing, they're developing, they're becoming what we call adult fish. Okay.
How far do you think they travel? Like how far away would they get?
Well, they can travel a long distance. Now, if we're talking about pink salmon don't necessarily travel very far because pink salmon are only out in the ocean for about 2 years. So it limits their ability to go, how far they can go. We feel that certain schools of salmon follow particular runs and follow particular paths. Okay, that we know that because we know that at least historically, if we know that we're at a particular place at a particular time, the salmon that are passing by there, we know that, okay, these are a Fraser River fish, or they're a Columbia River or a Skeena River fish, that kind of thing. Just by simply looking at the size and looking at the morphology of the fish, which is like how they're shaped, what are their sizes, what are their lengths, things like that.
How big do they get to be?
How big can they get?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, there's quite a large range when it comes to salmon. Pink salmon, can be on average around 4 to 5 pounds. A big pink salmon can be around 7 or 8 pounds. Your big Chinook, your spring salmons, I believe the world record, I think, is close to 100 pounds. So they can be really, really big, like 70-pound fish. They are rare, but it does happen. catching these days, catching a 40 or 50 pound fish would be something that's not unheard of, but rare. So we still kind of get those sizes of fish. So after they've been out for a couple of years, then they start heading back to their home rivers to spawn. So they get a sense that it's time to come back home. Now, as they're following they're following the coastline. So you can imagine they're in British Columbia. Okay, they start heading themselves up north, up to Alaska, right, over to Russia, down over the Southeast Asia, depending on the fish. They will go there, and then they'll work themselves up, following the coast, back to the Fraser River. Now, at one particular point, at a certain points along this journey, what will happen, probably when they're much closer to British Columbia, is they'll actually start to smell the scent, the chemical traces of their home river, and they actually key into that smell. So at that point, they're now using their sense of smell to find their way back home. Because, of course, salmon, the really interesting about salmon is that they are going to go back to their home river. They're going to go back to that same river. In some cases, we think they may even go to more or less the same stretch of river that they were born in. So they're using their sense of smell, and they're finding the way, they're going through the ocean and find their way, in this example, let's say the Fraser River. Now, once they get that instinct, what happens is that their body starts to change. Their colors start to change. The shape of their mouths start to change. The shape of their bodies start to change. Very characteristic of various species of fish. So some fish get like that green head with the red bodies. Those are usually, we would call those the sockeyes. We have other fish that are chum salmon, which have a really hooked beak with big teeth, big stripes on their sides, things like that. They're very characteristic. You can usually tell pretty easily what a salmon is when it's in its spawning colors. Anyway, so they start heading upstream. Now, certain species are going to travel various distances as they go upstream. Some have a very short distance. Some are only going to be, like if they're like a Chilliwack River fish or Vedder or a Chehalis River fish, they may only be, this may be a short distance for them, okay? Other salmon, they have to travel hundreds of kilometers, sometimes over 1,000 kilometers to get back to their home place to spawn. Okay. Now, as like I said, as they're going along, their bodies are changing, their colors are changing, things like that. They stop eating because all of their energies, all of their goal is to get back to breed, to get back to lay their eggs to spawn. So everything else about their bodies now becomes secondary. Okay, so all that energy is going into keeping developing the eggs or developing the sperm, keeping their back tail swimming and moving forward. Okay, so their bodies, the tissues are now getting softer. They're sometimes they're starting to rot. They're doing all these different changes, right? So anyway, they get back to their home river. Now, once they're at their home river, now they're looking for a particular spot in the river in order for them to lay their eggs. Now, certain salmon need a certain size of gravel. They need a certain velocity of water to be passing through in order for it to be a good spawning site, okay? So they all have their preferences. They all have all these different things. So what happens is that once she finds that particular spot, the female will then go and she'll dig what we call a red. So she will go and she'll use her tail to kind of dig a hole or a depression in the bottom of a gravel bed. Okay, and she'll be there, and she'll build a nest, build this red, and wait there for a male salmon to come. And a male salmon will come, and if he likes what he sees and she likes what she sees, then she will let her eggs go, and they fall into the gravel. Okay, that's why they need gravel, because it holds the eggs in place. The male salmon will then come and release the sperm, which will then once again fall through the gravel, percolate through the gravel, and will fertilize all the eggs. Okay. Once that is done, then fertilization and reproduction is complete. So the male and female, after a couple of days, will end up dying. They'll be totally spent. Their bodies are spent. Their energy reserves are spent. Their bodies are now depleted, and they die, and leaving the eggs to become the next generation of salmon. That will start the process all over again.
What can you tell me about the salmon forest that we hear about on the coast of British Columbia?
Sure. Well, that is a very, very interesting thing. It's a really cool thing, the salmon forest. Now, what they mean by a salmon forest is that they notice that those forests in those particular areas have very unique qualities about them. Okay, particularly when they're looking at nutrients, the nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and all the different chemicals and all the different things that we all need, that plants need in order to survive, right? We all have plants in our homes, and we think of fertilizing the plants and giving them water and giving them light and things like that. Salmon forests, we find, actually have lots and lots of nutrients in them. And when we test the trees and we test the nutrients in the soil, we find that the nutrients that we find there are coming from the ocean. Okay, it is up until we discovered what salmon forests are, the idea of nutrients or nutrient cycling has always been separate in regards to, we have cycling of nutrients on land, we have nutrient cycling in water. And we never thought that they would mix, right? How would nutrients from an ocean find its way onto land? But salmon force is an example on how, when salmon come and they lay their eggs and they die, the decomposition of those fish turn into nutrients, which is then taken up by the forest, taken up by the trees and things like that. That nutrients is spread by animals, by wolves, coyotes, bears, taking that salmon, dragging it into the forest, eating their fill, and then leaving the rest to rot. So when we look at the chemicals, the carbons and the nitrogens and all those different things within the trees, we can we have determined that those nutrients and those elements are coming from an ocean environment. They're coming from the salmon. And we've recognized, and by doing studies, it is determined that if all of a sudden those salmon were to disappear, it would have a negative impact on those trees. Those trees that have been relying on this source of nutrients for so long no longer would have them. So those forests would dramatically change. Those plants and the animals that live in there would dramatically change. We're not even it's still up in the air as to whether or not those forests could even really survive long term without the presence of salmon being there. So it's a really fascinating example how salmon is this linkage, this bridge between a marine environment and a land environment, a terrestrial environment.
That's fascinating. Are you concerned about the salmon stock on the coast of BC? Is there something that we should be concerned about?
Yes, I definitely say it is a concern. We know through anecdotal evidence, talking to First Nations and looking at fish populations that they had going throughout history, looking at our own records here, when we're looking at records of catches, because of course, British Columbia is famous for our salmon, right? I mean, we have the Fraser River has been up to one of the largest salmon rearing watersheds in the entire world. To be honest, I'm not sure if we would actually classify that anymore like that. It was at one time. Hopefully it still is. I don't think it would be anymore. But yeah, we've seen really, really big declines. And we could talk about overfishing. We could talk about environmental degradation, loss of habitat, things like that. Particularly right now would be climate change, changes to our climate, changes to temperature of our water, the changing of different seasons, getting rain during different times of the year. All of these things makes me really concerned about the future of our salmon stock. Yeah, it's a very complicated when you're dealing with an ecosystem, you're dealing with so many variables, so many things that have an input as to how this environment is going to run. And for millions of years, evolution and nature has created this balance, which has allowed everything to coexist and to work, right? Inputs and outputs, right? Turning into a balance that is beneficial for everybody. Things have been changing so quickly, right? That now those balances are out of sync, and nature is trying to find its new normal. And it is really I am not sure how it's all going to play out. So yes, there is definitely a concern, particularly when it comes to climate change, man-made factors that we as a society, as a people, have had impacts and are negatively affecting those populations.
I've been learning a lot about salmon and the various ecosystems of BC from working with you the last couple of years. And there was one thing that I heard you say about the rainfall and how it would delay the salmon from moving back to their spawning grounds. Can you tell us anything about that?
Sure, yeah. So salmon, particularly when they're in fresh water, right? They've left the ocean. Their bodies are starting to change. They're now in spawning mode. They're in the spawning stage of their life cycle. So they're following the rivers up. Okay. Now the thing to keep in mind here is, of course, salmon need water in order for them to swim. Okay. They're following the scent of their home river in that water. Okay. Now they are programmed to be in our rivers at a particular time of year, and they expect that, and history has genetically taught them, so to speak, to expect that the water levels are going to be at a particular point when they get there, because once you're in fresh water, the clock starts to tick biologically, right? They only have a certain amount of time. They can't go back into the ocean and kind of come out of spawning phase and wait. Once they're in, it's like a one-way trip, right? It's kind of like
Mhm.
on an escalator. People don't like it when you turn around on the escalator and start walking down. You're once you're on it, you're kind of on it, right? So they start going through the process, and they start heading to their home rivers. Now, when they're at their home river, if there's not enough water for them to go upstream, they're forced to wait. So they will wait in places like the Fraser River at the mouth of, let's say, the Chilliwack, waiting for the waters to go. Now what they're doing genetically, we think, is that they're waiting for a high water mark. They're going to wait for cold, fresh water to be pouring out of the Chilliwack, let's say. Water levels are rising, and it tells them, okay, the water is deep enough, it's cold enough, I'm going to start going upstream. Okay. Now, all that rise of water levels is due to rainfall, right? Temperatures get colder. We go from summer into the fall. We have more and more rain. We have higher amounts of rain. So that is a key thing that tells the salmon that it's time to go. Now, if the salmon don't get that rain, they don't get the cue to go. So they just simply wait, milling around at the base of the river while that clock is ticking. Okay. Now, what happens these days is the two things usually happen, right? Or three things. In the past, we would get that normal amount of rainfall, the right amount at the right time, and the fish would come up and do their thing, right? However, what we're finding more of, though, is that either the water is not coming, right? It's now coming at a different time, or it's much less, right? It's warmer as we go into fall. We're getting less rain until we're getting really, really late, almost into winter, for example. Okay, that kind of thing. So their clock is kind of ticking, and it kind of expires before they're able to get up to spawn. Or what happens is that when we do get rain, it's very, very dramatic. So now you get this big, gigantic flood of water. So now what happens is that the salmon say, oh, the water's here, and they go up. So sometimes that means that they get there and it's too early. So they've gotten to the grounds, but they're biologically not ready to spawn yet. Okay? It's like you going to you're going to the movie theater to catch the movie, and you're there 4 hours early. You
Yeah.
can't get in, you can't see the movie, so you're just milling around waiting for the doors to open, right? Now, we can wait for 4 hours. We may not like it, but we can.
Mhm.
Salmon, remember, that clock is ticking, so they may not be able to wait that 4 hours. So sometimes what happens is sometimes man has to, or the various agencies have to get involved. So sometimes if the salmon reach the spawning grounds early, sometimes they'll actually scoop up all the salmon and they'll actually cart them in big trucks downstream, make them do it all over again, right?
Hmm.
Or sometimes what they'll do, if water levels are really low and there's a particular barrier, they will scoop the fish if they can, and then take them above the barrier so that they can then go up on their way. Now, of course, whenever mankind comes and tries to help out, it's our intentions are good, but we're also adding another layer of stress, and we're not nearly as efficient as Mother Nature can be in getting these fish up. So we cannot necessarily rely on humans intervening in these courses, right? So it's a very, very inefficient way of doing it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Really quite a tragic thing, the way the climate changing affects the water levels when the
Yes.
water comes, also the water temperature.
Yes, water temperature is a very, very big deal. Water levels, see, because with a fish, their development when they're young, and even when they're going through their spawning phases, are part of it is based on temperature, right? Temperature really plays a big, massive role when they're going through development, right? So if the water temperature is high or low, it can delay or it can speed up development. So it really plays a really big, big role. Temperature also has a direct relationship with oxygen. The warmer the water is, the less oxygen it can hold. So when you're a fish and you're an adult and you're working upstream, you need as much oxygen as you can to get into those muscles for you to go upstream. If you run out of oxygen, you're not going to be able to swim as hard or as fast or as far. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the relationship between the ocean and the land with these salmon forests. There must be a relationship between the salmon and other marine species like the orca.
Oh, yes, by all means. Salmon is a huge supply of food and nutrients to the environment, right? To the ecosystem that they live in, right? That kind of thing. Because if you remember, I had talked about how salmon lay about 2,500 eggs. It's an average about 2,500 eggs,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Now, in a normal situation, right, in a healthy situation, if we can get just one out of every 2,500 eggs to live through adulthood, to migrate, to spawn, and to die, their offspring, those eggs, will produce enough salmon to keep the population stable. We only need one for every 2,500. Okay.
Mm.
However, we're at a point now where there have been changes where we're not getting that one out of 2,500 anymore. It might be one out of every 3,000, or one out of every 4,000. So that fraction's getting smaller. Now, that has an impact, right? Now, as people, we think of, well, there's less fish to catch, not so much fun there. We have to pay more for fish in the grocery store. But there's also all the different animals and all the different organisms that rely on the salmon to be there as well. So we could be talking about orcas, like you have already mentioned. Salmon, particularly for our resident killer whales, is a key source of food and nutrients for our resident killer whales. Killer whales are designed for hunting down salmon. Less salmon, less food for them, right? Particularly Chinook salmon or spring salmon. They're the really, really big salmon, right? That's a good food for an orca. An orca whale, of course, is very, very large. It needs a lot of food in order to survive. It burns just as many calories chasing a 4-pound or 5-pound pink salmon as it might a 50-pound Chinook salmon. So Chinook is really playing an important role, or has played and does play an important role in the health of the species.
All right. Well, Chris, this has been so informative and interesting, and it seems that the salmon is integral to the health of all of these different ecosystems on the west coast of British Columbia. And I think everybody now is going to know a lot more about why we need to take care of the salmon, why it's an important species, and as well why we need to take care of the whole environment, because it's affecting the salmon, which affects so many other things. So I think what we'll do is we'll say thank you very much for the information today, and we really appreciate all that you've been able to teach us.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was very nice talking to you.
Thanks, Chris.
No problem.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed this amazing episode with Chris Hall and Tim Stephenson. Thank you so much, Tim, for interviewing Chris. We learned so much about salmon and their journey. We also learned about how important they are to our ecosystem. For all those listeners who are listening right now, take some time to study about our BC salmon. Learn about the culture that has evolved around our salmon from the Indigenous people of British Columbia. Learn about the nutrients and the importance that salmon have for our local ecosystem, for our waters, our soil, our trees. Salmon are very important to us. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for another My Kids Locker COVID-19 Ed podcast episode. We hope that you've enjoyed this special episode on Monday that allows us to dive deeper with an expert. And Chris Hall was our expert today. Well, until next time, remember, less screens, more listening, more creating, and more innovating. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next time at the next My Kids Locker COVID-19 Ed podcast episode. Bye for now.